This is Anton. Anton, thank you so much for joining. You're assistant professor for the Department of Experimental and Applied Psychology. I was just wondering if you could introduce yourself briefly and just give a little bit more information about who you are.
So basically, yes, I'm the assistant professor of the Department of Experimental and Applied Psychology. This is the Faculty of Psychology, Taras Shevchenko University of Kiev, and I'm also affiliated with the Department of Psychology at University of Salzburg, where I'm currently a postdoc researcher
So
there.
I read the one study that you sent me, and I'm going to be reading the other one here soon. I was just curious, is there anything in your research that you found interesting that stood out to you as unique or different? Similar would be what was it? The anxiety and depression levels were low. That really stood out to me. I was wondering if that or you had more to talk about on that or anything else that may have jumped out to you.
We have actually been discussing this situation with several other professors that specialize in the field and do not specialize in the field, because there is kind of a discrepancy in our first study, the study that we ran in March, as soon as the war had actually begun. And what we have found there that the coping strategies that people use are kind of destructive in terms of that they start abusing psychoactive substances, caffeine, sometimes marijuana, smoking, and alcohol abuse was a little bit higher. But in the second study that we ran, we actually noticed relatively low levels of anxiety and depression, which was a sort of a contradiction with first of all, with what we have expected to see. And we were kind of like looking for the reasons to explain why it actually happened. Why did Ukrainians show relatively low levels of anxiety and depression while it should have been a little bit different? And if to dive into several points of explanation why that could have happened, we referred to this social phenomena that occurred after the beginning of the war. So as soon as people have survived through the first several days of the war, of the invasion, Ukrainians showed this phenomenon of social unity, probably what we call. So in social psychology, there is a law kind of that whenever you have an external enemy that threatens the specific social group, in this context we have Ukrainians, entire Ukrainian nation as a social group, it facilitates the internal unification mechanisms. So these internal differences, so let's say political or religious views within one group, kind of like dissolve, and the group is aimed at fighting with external enemy, in this context with Russia. So what we have been seeing, and that's probably not something new in the news, it's been described a lot that Ukrainians started helping with what they can financially, so donating to the army, volunteering, helping the territorial defense troops and the regular army, and helping out the internally displaced people. And this kind of like from the psychological standpoint, might have detracted the attention from depression and anxiety, because when everything happened, there were these recommendations from emergency psychologists or as professionals that work in the field of extreme psychology, what to do in situations where you cannot control anything. One of the recommendation was to do something that you find useful in the place where you are, having the resources that you have. So basically, if you could need a couple of warm socks for soldiers, that is already a significant contribution. So, and again, from psychological standpoint, being active and doing the purposeful activity, and under the purpose, we kind of like estimate whatever makes sense specifically to an individual, a specific individual. So if we talk right now, I find purpose or sense in this conversation, and I find it useful for myself. So when people are engaged in this type of activity, there is a tendency to reduce depression and anxiety, because from the mental health standpoint, several recommendations to reduce depression in general in normal life, we put it that way, is to find the purposeful or meaningful activity. Right. So that is reduces the rumination of all kind that individual showing signs of depression might have. And so we assume that this was the reason why the levels of anxiety and depression were relatively low in comparison to the average of the sample that we've obtained. And also another point that we came to the conclusion about is that the specificity of the sample. So we basically mostly have conducted this study among people who were not directly affected by the war, meaning that the percentage of people who have seen the military, the attacks, who probably have been bombed, was relatively low. Most of the people come from central regions, from Kiev, from western regions. So for them, just the fact that the war began was the most traumatic experience that they reported. So that might be the reason, or one of the explanations why why they show relatively low levels of depression and anxiety. So this is the sample-wise explanation.
Right. No, I appreciate it. When you were talking, it really stood out to me. They're doing purposeful work, and honestly, me personally, that's when my issues with PTSD and depression improved, when I started doing things that were more purposeful. So that did make a lot of sense to me. Another thing that stood out about one of your studies is PTSD and CPTSD. Those were average. And I was curious, do you think maybe that was because it was still during the acute phase? Like we haven't really seen the full effects of the trauma that has happened yet?
That is the most relevant explanation to that case, because we want to run the second study to see if the levels of PTSD and CPTSD have changed, since most of the studies that have been conducted on refugees from Syria, Afghanistan, victims from the war, they mostly have been conducted in the post-war period, when these people no longer are exposed to this particular traumatic event. And after discussing that with mental health specialists, we also kind of like assume that severity of symptoms or PTSD symptoms might show up later. And the specialists in this area say that it might take 6 months, 12 months, even 2 years sometimes after the acute phase of traumatic experience disappears or reduces. Symptoms may catch up later. So basically we estimate that in the second run we should see a bit higher scores of PTSD and CPTSD. Right. That's just the way the trauma works.
Something you mentioned earlier was during the acute phase, or in the very beginning, the first few weeks when it first happened, you saw an increase of substance abuse, marijuana, alcohol, and stuff like that. In my mind, that reminds me of like bad patterns of behavior. And I'm just wondering, like, if that's when PTSD starts, because my understanding is like if you start doing bad patterns and you do that systemically for a long period of time, then that would lead to systemic depression. Then you would have more severe issues with PTSD. I don't know. I was just curious if it was just a time thing.
Most probably that was just a time thing, since usually increase of let's call it reference to destructive or negative coping strategies is mostly a reaction to stress. And as our study of the first run and the second run showed, all Ukrainians, no matter were they affected directly by the war or indirectly, like air raid alarms or explosions somewhere in the area where they live, they all show the high level of acute stress survival, kind of, or experience of the acute stress. What we actually noticed in another study that we've been running, we just recently kind of like roughly looked on the data that we have, we put some emphasis on air raid alarms. So basically what that is a notification to inform that there is a potential threat of the rocket attack, and potentially this rocket may fly over the particular region where the person is. meaning that it might land or be shot and cause certain damage. What we noticed that at least 75% of our sample, and that was a longitudinal study with 300 something subjects, people A-rate alarms, no matter whether this is 1, 2, 3, 5 alarms per day, it no longer causes this anxiety, like situational anxiety, when you're kind of afraid that something bad is going to happen. This is irrational feeling. I guess everyone has experienced this sometime. When you are late for the train, you have this a little feeling like, okay, I'm stressed, and then the situational anxiety comes when you try to process, okay, what's my next step? What should I do? Buy another ticket or look for another train? That's the basic real life, peaceful life example. And with air raid alarms, we no longer spot this in our respondents, but when they report hearing the explosion, even if that happened not particularly in the area but somewhere far, they report having this state of anxiety. So
yeah,
it was the stimuli shift, we don't know, but probably we kind of like interpret it in terms in terms of the level of potential threat, let's put it that way. So air raid alarm does not necessarily predict a threat, and actual explosion predicts it, because what Russians do right now, they don't throw one rocket in one object, they throw 3, 4, 5, 10 that are going the same direction. So explosion number 1 means, and this is already a conditioned stimuli, that there will be at least one more. So that causes this situation.
Yeah. Another thing that you pointed out is not just the impact of war for people that are still here in Ukraine, but there's a large percentage of people that are refugees now that left and that are displaced without houses. And you're doing work and studies identifying the impacts of that too, correct?
Yes, we have it kind of like pre-registered. We want to run a major study, but it mainly we will focus on level of integration, like whether refugees in different countries in EU, how comfortable do they feel? So whether they work, whether they learn the language, whether they send their kids to local schools, because we hear different stories from different people from different countries. So we want to see what is the actual relevant situation with the refugees. Since in the studies that we have run before, we did not really have a statistically significant sample of people that are not in Ukraine, because most of our respondents were in Ukraine. So these effects that we have found, they are more relevant for Ukrainian citizens. And there was a slight difference in levels of depression and anxiety. So people who have left Ukraine, they have a little bit higher, average levels, but not statistically significant to report that to presence in Ukraine as a fixed factor, like that has an impact on levels of depression.
Okay. One of the other things that you mentioned was sleep studies and cognitive behavioral therapy. Just wondering if you could speak to that briefly.
Yes, that's the big project that we want to launch. So it goes without saying, it's evident and clear that any kind of potential threat to mental health, no matter what that is, PTSD, acute stress, it has direct or indirect impact, or it somehow reflects on sleep quality. And people who hear the explosions in the middle of the night, because we kind of know that most of the Ukrainians stopped performing this, let's call it the safety-seeking behavior, like going to the shelter anytime that air raid alarm is on. All these little aspects do have an impact on sleep. And with this project, what we will try to do is through the smartphone application, we will, first of all, assess whether standardized cognitive behavioral therapy techniques actually help to increase the sleep quality in the situation of crisis. So first of all, we focus on the reduction of anxiety that is an aspect or an issue for insomniacs. They call it the bad rumination. I mean, rumination in bed, when you try to go to sleep, but then you start thinking about a bunch of things, absolutely random things. I mean, not specifically war-related anything. And from the cognitive behavioral therapy standpoint, that is one of the things that prevents you from sleep. And the strategies that we would offer mainly focus on reduction of the rumination, reduction of the focus, thought focus, and eventually it should result into decreasing the sleep onset latency time, meaning how much it should take less time to fall asleep. And as previous studies show, we also kind of like conducted that, the longer is your sleep onset latency time, the worse is the subjective quality of sleep, meaning the more time it takes for you to fall asleep, the worse you think you have actually slept. And that's one of the factors. And there is another one, deep sleep. And if you have increased anxiety and you're constantly ready for a threat, even though there is no actual threat, the deep phase is significantly reduced, which also affects the subjective quality of sleep. And in order not to get into details, sleep deprivation and sleep quality overall may have long-term effects on mental health and physical health, and there are studies that prove that. So that's why I'm kind of like answering why we decided to focus on sleep. And the biggest advantage of the project, even if we pass the acute phase sometime, because this project will be implemented to say realistically in about 3 months, I think we will have to do the preparational work and then we will be able to launch it. Even if the acute situation changes, which is less likely to happen, it's still going to be useful, because I've been talking to several people, and it was kind of like surprising for me to see that the sleep problems or the sleep disturbances are so common among Ukrainians. And what is more, they are common for Ukrainians in Ukraine and common for Ukrainians outside of Ukraine, so for the refugees. It's just a brief observation, so it wasn't a pilot study. That is basically just confirms the relevance of this sleep project that we were going to implement and see if it works in the situation of crisis. And if it does, then we will just launch this specific part of the application available in Ukrainian to be used by all Ukrainians for free, basically. So we hope it's going to work out that way.
That's awesome. Yeah, I did notice my sleep was impacted when I came here. It was just a big transition. I have a history where I have spent a lot of time in war zones, but coming back to one, it was interesting with the air raids. My first air raids definitely was triggering, I guess we could say, but process it in a healthy way, moved on. I was going to ask you, if you don't mind, what is your personal experience with this war? I believe you said you were in Kharkiv. And for those that are listening that aren't familiar with Ukraine, Kharkiv's within 20, we're working out there right now. It's about 20 kilometers from the front line or the front line, because there's a lot of action right there.
My personal experience was, well, I have an emotional memory from it. It was literally terrible. I lived through all the scientifically reported stress stages. So first, when you undergo the derealization, that happened literally to every Ukrainian that I heard. So you don't really realize that it's actually happening. You feel like I'm dreaming and I should wake up soon, and in about a couple of hours that's gonna pass. Then the second is the feeling of being completely lost, like having no idea what's going to happen, not even within the nearest days, within the nearest hours. That is very frustrating, and you cannot plan anything. And I don't know if I should say luckily or not luckily, but I was not in Kiev, even though I lived there. We were visiting my wife's parents, so we were actually in Kremenchuk, which is in the very center of the country, and we were constantly doom scrolling, checking what we can do, whether we should evacuate, move somewhere, watching where the troops are coming. And I was originally born in Kharkiv region, and my family lived there. So, considering all this ambiguity and not knowing what's going to happen, I have evacuated my grandma, my mother. So we lived for some time together in this constant state of increased stress, trying to figure out what might happen. So, and we try to find some purposeful activities. One of the first things we've done, donating money. Second thing, what we've done, marketplace for psychologists. So we quickly organized within March the online acute help center, let's put it that way. So anyone who felt consequences or issues with mental health could book the session with our psychologists online and receive the assistance for free. And we had this on for 2 months, I think, for April and May, and our psychologists have been helping people with different issues online for free. So
Right.
some volunteering have done, and explosions and going to the shelter and air raid alarms and being in a shelter for 5.5 hours, like not knowing where the rocket is going to land. And I heard explosions and I saw the rockets flying.
Yeah.
So like pretty much everyone in Ukraine. So that was very, very, very stressful. The experience, that you would never wish anyone to go through. That's probably it.
Right. Did you notice any impacts, short-term, long-term, on your mental health? Did you see any personality traits that may have shifted? And if I may say so, you, as well as a lot of the Ukrainians that I've talked to, are so positive. So I feel like that there's definitely something that you all are doing that's unique. That's something that we could share with other people, because whatever you're doing to stay positive, and I believe you mentioned purposeful activities and giving back to your community, I think that there's something there, and that's really powerful.
That's what I'm trying to do. Like every day, I'm try to dedicate and do something that will majorly or not majorly, or at least somehow contribute to the how would you call it? Probably let's put it to the national victory. So that what we say in Ukrainian language, to make the victory come closer by our actions, and no matter how big that action is. So trying to do that. And regarding mental health and in short-term perspective, of course, I had no appetite during the entire March, probably. So I literally could not eat, was forcing myself to do that. And in long-term perspective, I think I just became more worried about things. So I started worrying about things that I would never worry before. And is that the impact of war? I'm not sure, but this is just the fact that I'm experiencing. And I'm not sure if this is any kind of a PTSD symptom or anything, but lack of concentration. That's what I also noticed so that's normal. Unfortunately, that is normal after surviving the long-term increased stress. Because of the effects it has in certain areas in brain, especially in hippocampus, it usually results into worsening the memory and into lack of concentration. So lack of concentration, I have experienced that. So it took extra effort to focus on doing things that I would previously not have extra effort to do that. So I guess these are just
struggling to remember. Like I struggle to remember things that I've read. I'd have to read it twice. Those are some of the things that I had issues with too. So if someone in Ukraine is struggling with depression, anxiety, or maybe even sleep, is there any, just want to give them one or two references that you can think of off the top of your head that maybe I can put in the show notes that they can go reach out and try to get some help?
That's quite a tough question, since there are quite a lot of resources. So about the techniques, so since I'm not a practical psychologist, but more of a research psychologist, like knowing smart things, finding purposeful activity, like no matter what that is, it kind of helps to distract and somehow increase the focus, at least for some time. And regarding sleep, just a very quick recommendation, since we focus on this rumination most of the time. when people have problems with falling asleep or waking up later on. This is actually any simple meditation that you can find online or on YouTube. It's just relaxing music and breathing exercises. There is an exercise called 1/3. So basically, you take around one proportion out of 4 to take a breathe in, which looks like basically this is the fast breathe in, and then another 3 portions is the breathe out. So basically, you breathe in faster than you breathe out. And this technique works for reduction of situational anxiety, at least on the physical level. It works. And it helps to reduce this rumination that are going and increased anxiety against the situational. And if we talk about depression, it's getting a little bit more complicated because we have clinical depression that should be treated with antidepressants mainly. And depression as a situational psychological state, which is less severe and is triggered not by some changes in the brain particularly. So breathing sometimes, but this technique might also help, but in case this is not the pathological diagnosis in a situation.
Right. Awesome. I appreciate it. That's good information. And last question from me, unless you want to say you have anything else you'd like to share. I was just curious. You do have more research that's coming. Do you anticipate or expect to see anything, or you just go into it really optimistic and whatever you see, you just look to try to explain why that may be?
We try to stay optimistic. So we hope we want to run second waves of studies to see if there is any change after the year of war. I personally hope to see no significant change. So, for example, that the levels of depression and anxiety would stay low, that the resilience would be higher, that people would not show the PTSD symptoms, that refugees that are in different countries would report that they feel comfortable and they feel integrated. And no matter what happens, they still want to return home and they're waiting for the right moment to do that. But actually, there is kind of like an assumption that we talked about, that people who are integrated, or at least feel they're integrated, they left here, and people who are homesick or nostalgic maybe about the times that they had before the war, most of them have returned. But it's also relative, and it's hard to estimate. So basically, we hope to see the results that would be optimistic. And with the Big Sleep project, we really want to see the results that the CBD techniques that we would offer are actually helpful for the situation of crisis, and that we would help Ukrainians sleep better than they do. Of course, there are a lot of exceptions, like we don't recommend using it if you're near the front line, if air raid alarm is not predicting the rocket attack. So that's mainly for people who live not near, at least 50 kilometers away from the front line, because ethical issues that concern personal safety. So, for example, we cannot force the person to sleep well if there is a chance that there will be an uncontrolled missile, or
and they need you to wake up and get to a bunker. Right?
Yeah. But
awesome.
We mainly focus, so if the person woke up and because of the air raid alarm, so after performing proper safety behavior, using our app, it will help this person to fall asleep faster. And of course, we are not working on increasing the deep phase of sleep, so that person will still be aware of important critical signal if there will be one.
Awesome. Well, with that, I have no more questions. Is there anything in summary that you'd like to say before we jump off here? I really appreciate your time, and thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for inviting. The last thing, well, we all hope we will stay strong, and that everyone will continue doing what she has been doing before to contribute to the entire nation, to every Ukrainian, and to give and to help as much as we can help with our tools and resources that we have. So that's what we are trying to do, and that's what I notice many people are also trying to do. So it's not a time to be selfish, it's a time to think a little bit more broadly.
Absolutely. And with that, we'll wrap it up. I really appreciate it. If there's anything I could ever do to help in any way, please let me know. I appreciate the chat, and I can't wait to see your studies and what comes out. The sleep study is a really interesting one. I bet it would be very helpful, because I find if I don't get enough sleep, it only takes a few days before I start feeling a little bit anxious, a little bit depressed, So if you do that systemic, it gets real chronic, and it can be really, really uncomfortable.
That's exactly how it is. I could have said we could have dedicated another recording just for the sleep issues, like general sleep issues in crisis areas and in normal areas, what to do and what are the recommendations, because honestly, the recommendations are so simple. The problem usually goes with implementing those recommendations in regular life.
Right. Oh, that reminds me, before we wrap it up, I was going to ask you what kind of routine that you did that helped your mental health. I think you mentioned that, and I didn't talk on that yet.
Yeah, considering the simplicity of all recommendations, one of the recommendations concerned discipline and sleep schedule. So go to bed at one time and wake up at the same time every day. So I ended up going to bed at around 3 a.m., usually waking up at around 10 to 11 a.m. So that was stable. And it was very hard to start exercising, but this is actually very critical. So all these simple recommendations that say if you're stressed, do at least some exercise, because it helps your body to relax a little bit. It's so hard to start, but if you try that, at least you spend 15 to 20 minutes a day, at least, that kind of helps on a physical level. So this is another simple recommendation that I tried to implement. So I couldn't say that was helpful at that time, because there were other things more stressful, pressing, right? Mm-hmm. But at least allowed somehow to return to start doing things again, instead of sitting and waiting, not knowing what's going to happen in an hour, in 2 hours, and so on.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, sir. I hope you have an awesome day and you have a good evening. And if you ever need anything from me, let me know. Once I finish editing and drafting my creatives, I will notify you when I'm going to release your episode, and you can look for it.
Thank you. And as soon as we have some results published and available of our studies, I will also let you know.
Awesome. Thank you so much. You have a good evening.
You have a good one too. And again, thank you for inviting. Hope that's been somehow useful, whatever we have talked about.
It's very neat. I appreciate it. I really value mental health, and it's interesting seeing that you all are applying simple mental health practices that have been proven to work for even like frontline warriors, and to see you provide it for an entire nation is really cool. I think it's going to be positive in a big way.